Thank you very much for the invitation. Greetings to Your Excellencies, greetings to the organizers. Thank you very much to the Institute of Policy Studies for hosting me and for hosting this very timely event. And greetings, of course, to everybody who's following this online via YouTube or other social media. I think the reality is that what's happening in Sudan now, Sudan has finally made the front pages of the news, given that it's been neglected significantly over the past years, during a period in which it desperately needed attention, particularly at a time in which it was navigating a very difficult transition. I think that there are the immediate reasons for the crisis, and then there are the contextual reasons for the crisis. The immediate reasons for the crisis are quite simple. In February, the army chief, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, announced that the Rapid Support Forces, which is an organization, an armed organization, that was established before during the Omar al-Bashir's time when he was in power, that the Rapid Support Forces, which over the past 5 years has become an increasingly independent organization, were able to establish its own international agreements, receiving its own funding, with its leader, Mohammed Hamdan Doglo, otherwise known as Hemeti, being received internationally in his own capacity. General Abdel Fattah Burhan of the Sudanese army announced that this force led by Hemeti should be merged with the army. And the reaction of Hemeti has been to launch an attack on the Sudanese army, to launch an attack to prevent the merging, because, to put it quite bluntly, Hemeti believes that any merging of his forces with the Sudanese army would essentially result in the clipping of his wings or its significant diminishing of his power. Those are the immediate reasons, but there are contextual reasons regarding why this conflict has come about. In that, in last year, in December, there was an agreement that was brokered by international actors between the army and between a number of civilian parties. It was called Al-Ittifaq Al-Itari, the framework agreement. In January, General Abdel Fattah Burhan made an announcement saying that this framework agreement needed to include more civilian parties, essentially trying to dilute the influence of a group of civilian parties called the Forces for Freedom and Change, a group that is essentially made up of leftist, communist parties, and the Hizb al-Ummah, which is a party that was once led by the late Sadiq al-Mahdi, who was Prime Minister of Sudan in the late 1980s. Burhan said that this agreement should expand beyond these groups and should include civilian parties. There were questions as to why Burhan would insist on the inclusion of the civilian parties, but we won't necessarily go into that at the moment. And as a result, a meeting was held in Cairo in which there was an attempt to expand these civilian parties. It is at this point that there were suggestions that the civilian parties of the Forces for Freedom and Change that were expecting the transition to hand over all power to them were very frustrated at the inclusion of these extra civilian parties. So the rumors were that they were gathering around Hemeti. The suggestion was that Hemeti might be able to use his force in order to pressure Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to hand over power to them instead of expanding the civilian agreement. In order to understand the significance of that, we have to go back slightly further, in that it's important to stress, and I hesitate to say it in front of His Excellency, the Ambassador of Sudan, in that when Omar al-Bashir was toppled in 2019, there were two prevalent narratives. The first narrative was one in which it was a Sudanese revolution, the people taking to the streets that toppled the regime, and that therefore we were embarking on a democratic transition. The second narrative, however, is the one that is prevalent amongst the political actors in Sudan and amongst the international actors, which is that Omar al-Bashir was toppled by US sanctions that lasted over 30 years. And as a result, it is not the Sudanese people who should dictate the transition, but rather the international powers that sanction Sudan. In other words, because Omar al-Bashir was toppled by sanctions, the international community is the one that dictates the terms for Sudan's rehabilitation. And one of the proof of that is that when you look at some of the measures that the Sudanese government or the Sudanese transition embarked on, such as normalization of ties with Israel, such as the suggestion of removing Islam from the constitution in a peace agreement signed with some of the rebel groups, these are policies that the Sudanese people would never democratically vote for. They would never give a democratic mandate for these initiatives, suggesting the only way they could have been implemented is by the imposition of these policies, the ideological imposition, as opposed to engaging with the Sudanese parties. And this is where we need to provide some context in terms of what happened. And I won't go on too long on this particular point. One of the things that's worth noting is that when you look at the Arab Spring movements, when you look at what happened in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, when you look at what happened in some of these other areas, such as Spring, the beneficiaries of the Arab Spring were essentially the Islamist parties. In Sudan, after Omar al-Bashir was toppled, the suggestion was that if we go immediately to elections in Sudan, there is a risk that the same scenario will be repeated again, that elections are held, that Islamist parties come to power again with a democratic mandate. And therefore, there was an inclination in Sudan that instead of going towards elections, instead of repeating what happened in Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt in terms of the democratic elections, we should establish a negotiated transition that delays elections, that allows this transition to embark with ideological changes before we allow the Sudanese to choose. And this is why, instead of going to elections to establish a democratic mandate, what we had instead was an agreement between the civilian parties, the Forces for Freedom and Change, and between the army once more. Essentially, the parties that were concerned that they would not win elections, that were concerned that if they hold elections, they would be the ones sidelined, decided instead to enter into an agreement with the army in order to negotiate this transition period. And as a result, we had this transition in which the army would lead for 2 years and there would be a civilian government, and then power would be handed towards a civilian government. The reason that context is important is because it explains why this transition agreement failed. When the 2 years passed and the time came to hand over power to the civilian parties, some of the Darfurians, such as Jibril Ibrahim, such as Minni al-Minnawi, two leaders who enjoyed sweeping international support in the 2000s. Jibril Ibrahim, who led his forces all the way to the gates of Khartoum in Durman in 2008, threatening the Sudanese regime before the peace agreement allowed for peace to reign in Sudan. Even Jibril Ibrahim and the Darfurians began to accuse the Forces for Freedom and Change that they were about to receive disproportionate power on the basis of a transition that had no democratic mandate. To put it more simply, Jibril Ibrahim and Minni al-Minnawi and other parties that were celebrated once by the international community began to say, why should the army hand over power to civilian parties that would never be able to win elections? And to put this into further context, the transition agreement gave 67% of the parliament appointed to these political parties, suggesting that they managed to take the state without ever going back to the Sudanese people. The reason I mentioned this point is to highlight that the Sudanese transition until now has not been about allowing the Sudanese to vote or choose their leaders, but has been a negotiated transition because of a wariness that the Sudanese people might choose wrongly, as the people in Tunisia chose wrongly, as the people in Libya chose wrongly, as the people in Egypt chose wrongly. And this is why when we put this now into context back to today in terms of the fighting, the reason that now we see the fighting in Sudan is because no one truly believes that the transition was about democracy. They believe the transition was about implementing the ideological changes that the international community desires in Sudan. That's why Hemeti has been appearing on Israeli channels, or his advisors have been appearing on Israeli channels, repeating the same rhetoric of, we are fighting radical Islamists. We are fighting, these are guys who want to put these radical ideas that Israel has been fighting all this time. And note this particular point, that Hemeti, who has been an essential part of the transition process for the last 5 years, in his 5 years of working with international actors, in his 5 years of working with Volker, the international envoy, in his 5 years of working with Washington, working with the UAE, working with Saudi Arabia, working with the Sudanese civilian parties, Hemeti has come to the conclusion that this argument of fighting against Islamists and guaranteeing that Islamists will not come to power is the argument that the international community want to hear. Hemeti is deploying an argument that he has seen resonate amongst the international community. And the other thing that's worth noting is this, and it might be slightly controversial to say, in that when you look at the revolutions that took place in the region that sought to topple authoritarianism and establish democratic transitions, we saw that the opposition to these transitions were mainly led by an axis of the UAE, an axis of Saudi Arabia, an axis of Egypt afterwards when Sisi came to power. In other words, these powers did not celebrate any of the revolutions that took place in the Arab Spring. The only revolution that they celebrated was Sudan. So much so that the Saudi ambassador caused anger when he announced and said that but for Saudi Arabia, Omar al-Bashir would not have fallen. And many Sudanese people were upset with that because they truly believed that they had embarked on a revolution. Yasser Arman, who is one of the leaders of one of the armed groups, when he was asked about the role of the international players such as the UAE, he said there is no harm in relying or getting help from the UAE to topple the Islamists and to fight back against the Islamists. The point here is that what we're seeing unfold is not the decline of a democratic transition, because there was never necessarily a democratic transition taking place in Sudan. There was a negotiated transition. And this is why when we go back to Burhan, when he refused to hand over power to the civilian parties, what Burhan did, which was, in my opinion, a masterstroke, Burhan announced and essentially gave an great international community. Either you let me rule the same way you let Sisi rule, the same way you let other people rule in the region, or I will hold elections. Burhan announced in 2021 essentially that he would hold elections next year if he was forced essentially to hand over power to the civilian parties. And note the reaction of the international community. It was not, okay, let's go to elections. It was panic. It was, if Burhan is going to hold elections, this is not what we want, because we don't trust the result that these elections will deliver, given what we saw in Tunisia, what we saw in Libya, what we saw in Egypt. And that's why instead of pressuring Burhan, they entered into a new negotiations with the army with the sole purpose of trying to convince him not to hold elections. And this is why Burhan, the army chief, every time he's under pressure to hand over powers to these civilian parties that Sudanese are in consensus would not be able to win elections, Burhan says either I should rule or I will hold elections. And this is why Burhan has become problematic for the international community, and why the international community, instead of standing with the Sudanese army, instead of asserting the integrity of the state, instead of asserting the integrity of a national army, a national institution, they are instead pushing for a mediation between Hemeti and between Burhan, almost as if they are officializing the presence of two independent armed forces in the country. They are seeking to hold mediation in Riyadh, almost as if a repeat of Yemen, whereby the Houthis, who toppled the internationally recognized government, were officialized in the mediation as a legitimate party. And as a result, Yemen now is on the verge of being split between two different countries. The point here being is that while it's true that there is a lot of both sidism, while it's true that there's an assertion that this is perhaps two factions fighting with one another, the crux of the issue has always been in Sudan that since the toppling of Omar al-Bashir, the international actors do not believe it was a revolution. They believe that it was, the government was toppled by sanctions, and therefore the transition should be a negotiated one, not a democratic one. And this is where I enter the conclusion of my statement, because I know that people probably want to hear more from the ambassador than they want to hear from me. But the point here being is that to conclude is this: the solution to Sudan requires a democratic mandate that cannot be challenged. That can only come via elections. Whatever you may say about Libya, about Egypt, about Tunisia, the reality is that the reason they were called democratic transitions is because there was a clear mandate. The issue in Sudan is not one of the army, it's not one of force, it's not one of the military. The issue in Sudan is the international community is not sure whether it can trust the Sudanese population to vote, and therefore they've embarked on supporting a transition that guarantees that the Sudanese will not vote incorrectly. And this is why at this moment in time, the civilian parties that stand to benefit from this transition, the civilian parties that took 69% of the parliament by negotiated agreement, and who in elections are unlikely to win 69% of the seats by any stretch of the imagination, they are more inclined today towards Hemeti pressuring the army, then they are inclined towards supporting the Sudanese National Army and trying to restore a democratic transition. And to conclude, this is why what's happening in Sudan, the transition, has been one of an attempt at social engineering. And this is why the Sudanese people feel so aggrieved that despite embarking in popular protests and trying to demand a democratic transition of their own, the reality is that they feel that that has been hijacked by international actors that preferred to dictate the process of the transition, to dictate normalization with Israel, to dictate removing Islam from the constitution, to dictate these ideological changes before any move is made towards elections in Sudan. This is just a general context, but the crux of the issue is a very simple one. It's about, do we let the Sudanese vote? And the answer of the international community at the moment is, the Sudanese cannot be trusted. Let's delay it further and continue with this negotiated arrangement between our preferred political parties and the army, and we see where it goes from there. And now we're seeing that as a result, the power is not determined by mandates or elections. Power today is being determined by the barrel of the gun. I'll leave it here and thank you very much for this opportunity.